So Fred, you've been an investor in New York in the bubble, in the crash, in the early days coming back, in another bubble, in a reset. If you could go back in time, what's the most fun?
Right now,
this is a pretty amazing moment for me. I mean, I grew up, I was born and raised in New York City. I actually pitched Fred and his partners at Flatiron about 25 years ago. I remember being in your office and
remember what you pitched?
Community Connect. It was an early social network code. They passed, which is amazing to see you kind of here again. But having lived through the 1.0 era in a city like New York, from a founder's perspective, would love to get what it was like you at Flatiron, Fred, of like starting Flatiron as a venture firm to compete against a lot of Silicon Valley firms in that era.
Well, we started Flatiron because the internet happened, and we thought that we could create a venture capital firm that was just focused on the internet. We thought New York was a great place to do it because we thought media and financial services would be some of the first industries to get impacted, all of which turned out to be true. But people did consider it kind of a crazy idea at the time. You're just going to invest in the internet? Like, what about everything else? And we were like, well, there isn't going to be anything else in 5 or 10 years. No one really believed that, but that also sort of turned out to be true.
Did that orientation towards New York fast forward to starting USV? And I know you and Brad, like, it was pretty dark times in the venture industry then. And I know that first fund took you guys a while to raise. Was New York a liability?
We hired a couple women to help us raise that fund, and Jane and Dana were their names. And they were like, you can't raise a fund focused on New York. Like, that's a bad idea. So they really coached us not to do that. And so we had a sort of a location independent thesis that we eventually raised on. But I think in hindsight, they were probably wrong, because I think that New York had by then become a real entrepreneurial community. And I think there was a real there. But the conventional wisdom was, don't try to create a New York focused firm in 2003.
Did you find any advantages of being in New York at the end of the day?
There was less competition here. Like, you know, if you really think about it, in 2003, there were a handful of venture firms formed that turned out to be, you know, sort of brand name firms 10, 15, 20 years later. And that's hard to do, but it wasn't as hard to do in New York, because we didn't have, like, if we tried to do that in Silicon Valley, it would have been really, really hard. But here in New York, it wasn't that hard to kind of become a go-to firm pretty quickly.
The strengths and weaknesses of entrepreneurs that were based here versus in the Bay Area or other areas?
I mean, the conventional wisdom was that the strongest technologists were in the Bay Area. And in New York, you had more market-focused people who knew the industries or knew the customers, but really weren't technologists. But the thing that was happening was that you didn't have to necessarily be the most brilliant computer scientist to build a web application or a website or anything. By 2003, 2004, there was a lot of tools that you could use to build it. So it turned out that, like, being the best technologist wasn't necessarily the thing you needed to be to win.
Yeah.
So Rebecca, we'll go back to the late 90s. You're a kid, but like, when did you first become aware of anything technology-wise going on in New York?
I don't actually think I really became aware of anything technology-wise going on in New York until I left New York. And I kind of grew up in the Bay Area technology scene that way, but was pulled by kind of the excitement of what was felt earlier and kind of bubbly in New York, and kind of more on the come at that point. But also, I like the intersection of technology and industry, and technology and market, and the type of founders that are interested in that and focused on that, and see the opportunity not necessarily in the technology itself, but in its connectivity to how it can impact a market that it's going into. And one of the things that I have always loved about USV and resonated with me is that, you know, we're this thesis focused firm, but no thesis has ever been about technology. It's always been about, we don't mention any technology in any of our theses. We're a technology focused fund. All of our investments are about technology, but they're about what technology can create and how it can shift markets. And I think New York really understands that in a lot of ways. Our portfolio is all over, but I think that resonates to a New York founder in a specific way.
Anything surprise you being back here in New York as a VC, as far as something you didn't expect when you moved back?
Yeah, I mean, I think, San Francisco has a lot of Kool-Aid. And so even though I wanted to come back, I certainly had, my entire venture experience was out there, and I had certainly drank a lot of it. And so, I think there are a lot of big generalizations. I think you are kind of taught to believe if you're a technologist, you live on the West Coast. And if you're a market person, you live in New York. And I think increasingly, as we all know, that's not really true.
Sure.
And I think as some of the New York companies have scaled and created ecosystems around them, you see great technologists leave them and build teams around them, or full technology teams spin out, and more holistic approaches than I probably gave New York credit for when I was first moving back. But then on the, I think was attracted to and excited to learn that New York still felt kind of communal, kind of the technology in the VC world here still kind of feels small, still kind of feels like a network altogether in a way that I think San Francisco doesn't. And maybe that's evolved, but I think there's a collaborative element in New York that I've always enjoyed.
And setting out to build USV, Fred, your blog has been, so well respected, well regarded. When you started writing it, did you think it was going to have such an impact?
No, definitely not. We were looking at the sector, online publishing tools. And so we decided to start using them. And I just found that it was incredible to be able to put our ideas out that way. And I really enjoyed doing it. And it allowed us to actually build a brand very quickly. That in hindsight, I'm not sure how we would have done it any other way. But it wasn't intentional, right? It wasn't like, oh, we're going to use these online tools to build a firm and build a brand. It was the opposite. We're just going to use these tools, and then we realized that that's what happened.
And Rebecca, you're a journalist turned investor. Did this kind of writing, thinking out loud culture, is that particularly attractive to your journalistic past?
Yeah, though it's really different than journalism in a way that I have grown to really admire. I think one of the things that we value here, which I think I'm not sure I fully appreciated until I got here, is the idea of kind of half-baked thinking and getting out imperfect ideas. Journalism is sometimes about getting out the right story and getting up facts. And I think what USV is about, and in some ways, I think Fred's blog, like if Fred doesn't always spell check all the blogs, or certainly doesn't edit all the blogs. And I think that's kind of been a feature, not a bug, and it's kind of set this tone of our goal isn't to publish the answer, and it's not to publish, the ultimate market map or the ultimate overview. It's to publish rough hypotheses and get them out there and encourage conversation and debate and kind of interaction in a way that maybe, the perfect polished story wouldn't do. And I think that is a real kind of ethos of this firm in general, and a big benefit of it.
But actually, the story of how ABC got started is actually an interesting story about New York and Silicon Valley. So one of the early blogging entrepreneurs in New York was a guy named Nick Denton, who started Gawker and a whole bunch of media businesses. And he was having a party at his loft apartment because Ben and Mina Trott, who were the founders of a company called TypePad, and Movable Type was actually, I think, the software. I can't remember exactly. It's a long time ago. It's 2003. Were in town from the Bay Area. And so he threw a party for them and he invited all his friends in online media to come. And I went and I met them. And I remember Mina saying to me, oh, all you need to do is go to typepad.com, log in, make a name, and then you can be a blogger. I was like, well, that's pretty cool. So I went home and logged into typepad.com, typed in my name, and I was like, well, I need a blog that begins with A. so I could be at the top of the results. So I came up with ABC, and originally it was abc.typepad.com. I ended up having to buy abc.com after a while. But that's how it happened. And so it was interesting. It's like Nick was like really kind of a classic New York entrepreneur, very much a media obsessed human as opposed to like a technology obsessed human. And, you know, he, in sort of very Nick fashion, invited all these people together, and I met these founders, and that's how it all happened. It's very, I mean, I guess something like that could happen in Silicon Valley too, but that was a very New York moment for me.
So if you go back to when Flatiron shut down, which if I understand correctly, wasn't necessarily your first choice and dream, but it was a product of the times.
We had one major capital partner in Flatiron, which was Chase Manhattan Bank. And they got cold feet after the internet blew up. They were just like, we went out, you know? And so that's what happened.
So what, in that moment when you realized, okay, this is not going to be what I hoped it would be, what did you think your next move was then? And how quickly did you come to like, no, I need to stay in this game?
I was always about staying in the game. Like it never occurred to me. Well, first of all, I don't know that I could do anything else. Like I've done this my entire adult career. It's the only thing I really know how to do. So it never passed my mind that I'd have to go find something else to do. And it took a couple of years. Like Flatiron shut down in 2001, and we didn't start raising USV until 2003. So there was a period I was managing out the Flatiron portfolio for the folks at Chase. So I was reasonably busy doing that, but spent a lot of time networking, trying to find somebody to start a venture firm with.
And when you co-founded in USV, Fred, or founded USV, was there a much different approach than what you did at Flatiron Partners? Did you say, these are the lessons learned, this is what I should do again? And this.
That's a great story. So my partner, Brad and I started the firm together. We had a lot of conversations about, what became USV would be. And I really just wanted to just keep doing what we were doing. I was like, it worked. We got a bad break. The market broke at the wrong time. And, our partner bailed on us, but let's just keep doing the same thing. And Brad was like, no, that's not going to work. We're going to have to have a thesis. We're going to have to, differentiate ourselves. Like we're going to have to stand for something. And I was like, really? That sounds like a lot of work. And he's like, yeah, it's going to be a lot of work, but it's going to be good. It's going to be good for us. So we spent a lot of time grinding on the thesis. And I can't say that I really was excited to do that, but it did pay a lot of dividends. And when we eventually did raise the fund, we actually had like a playbook that we were ready to run.
What's the genesis story of Fred and Brad?
We sat on a board together in 1996 and 97 for a company that Flatiron Partners was an investor in, and Brad's firm at the time, AT&T Ventures, was then. It's a company called Multex. And there was one moment where I was like, oh, this guy's really smart. The company was really struggling, and it was a pre-internet sort of client-server architecture. And the company was literally staring into the abyss. They're going to go out of business. And Brad suggested to the founder, why don't you build a web client that could run in this new Netscape browser that AT&T Ventures had been an investor in. And then you can just connect to a server over the internet, and you can provide the same product without having to run like a really expensive T1 line to every one of your customers. And the founder was like, that's the most ridiculous idea. You don't realize how complex our software is. We could never run it in a browser, right? And then the next board meeting, like 60 days later, when the company's like now on death's door, the founder shows up at the board meeting and says, we came up with this incredible idea. We figured out how to run our application in a web browser. We re-architected the whole system. Literally, Brad's playbook read right back to him. And Brad's sitting there like looking at him like this is my idea, right? Never said a word. And I walked out and I'm like, he took your idea. And Brad's like, it's fine. Like this company's now going to make it. It's all good. Like the founders, that's what we got to do. We just got to get them on the right path. And I was like, oh, he's really smart.
One of my favorite things about USV is I feel like you always say that you don't think USV would have been nearly as successful without Brad. And Brad always says he doesn't think USV would have been as successful without you. And it's a really like true complementary partnership.
Well, I sort of think of it as like brains and bronze. Now I'm not saying I'm strong, right? Like I'm not saying I'm like the bronze, but like that's definitely the brains, right? He would come up with all the ideas and I'm just broadcast them out, take full credit for them, put them on my blog, and boom, they go out. Founders would come knocking on the door, and like Brad would never get bummed about that. In the same way that he didn't get bummed about the other situation, he was just like,
Was there a moment, Fred, if you think back over the rise, Silicon Alley 1.0 rise, the fall, the resurgence, was there a moment on the way back up where you're like, okay, we're not going back down. We matter and we're going to continue to matter?
We made a bunch of investments in New York-based companies in the period from like 2004 to 2009. Etsy, MongoDB would be two really well-known names. But there were others. A few companies sold out early. Scott Belsky's Behance sold to Adobe. Josh Schachter's Delicious sold to Yahoo. So there was a bunch of early exits, and also some really big companies that got going. And I guess I would say by like 2009, 2010, we just felt that not only in our portfolio, but we could also see out and around in the landscape around us that there were lots of big companies getting built here. And, that's what you need, right? You need the big companies to be successful, and you need lots of people who are in those big companies to leave and start their companies. And that's the Silicon Valley story that's played out over, 50, 60 years now. And you could tell by the latter part of the 2000s that was happening here.
Yeah. How important was Google making a real?
I think Google was critical because Google lured a bunch of Bay Area engineers back to New York who really wanted to be here for family reasons and other reasons. And Google made it okay for them to come here and built a big facility here. Also, I think it made it a safe place for engineers to relocate to, because if it didn't work, I could always get a job at Google. I think Google building a huge workforce in New York was certainly one of the 2 or 3 biggest things that happened in the development of the New York tech ecosystem. You could argue maybe the biggest. I'm not sure it is the biggest, but it's definitely top 3.
What are the other 2 in the top 3?
Union Square Ventures.
Yeah. Rebecca Kaden's return.
Yeah, your return. I don't want to. That sounds egotistical, but it's not just us. There's a few other serial entrepreneurs who built multiple companies here that have had a very large impact. It's hard to like say.
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt, your guys' importance in building out the community was a big factor. And Brad and I, as we were, raising our first fund, I mean, at least pointing to you guys and saying, look, you can build a system venture firm based here. I mean, it was a big data point. For sure.
Yeah, but everybody looked at us and they were like, yeah, but you guys aren't Brad.
Well, the funny thing is, like, when I got into venture business in the mid 80s, there were venture firms in New York, but there were no startups in New York.
Yeah.
And the reason that there were venture firms in New York, because you had Wall Street was taxed. So there were lots of people who kind of caught the bug of tech investing and wanted to do it in an earlier stage. And so they were here. And I think there's always been venture capital firms. I guess my point is there's always been venture capital firms in New York, even before there was a real startup ecosystem. So I think the idea that you couldn't build a good venture firm here seems nuts to me.
Yeah. New York now is running at about 80% of the raw seed volume of the Bay Area.
The whole Bay Area?
On a quarter by quarter basis.
Of the whole Bay Area?
Yeah. Last couple of quarters, or about the last year, it's been around that level.
Wow.
So that's presumably at some level predictive of the big outcomes, not perfectly, but some level. Either of you guys, do you think New York could ever become the first tech market in the country?
If you look at tech markets, they're created by major ecosystems, right? Like the reason that the Bay Area is what it is because of a few ecosystems that spun out the talent and the best of which then created ecosystems on top of them. So for that to happen, you have to have the major outcomes that just create that kind of momentum. So I don't think it's impossible to happen. I think we have quite a long way to go for that to happen. I don't think we're, kind of knocking on the door, but you just have to have some really big wins. If you think of to me, the biggest moments of New York tech history are the ones that created some ecosystems around them, whether those are individuals like a Kevin Ryan or someone like that, or companies like a MongoDB or an Etsy or Google coming here or Facebook coming here, or, whenever you see full teams that spin out and come and pitch you and they came from a New York company, that's ecosystem building, and then create the capital that can go back into it.
New York has got a very strong AI talent ecosystem because of Wall Street and lots of early AI that was done here. So I don't think New York is wildly disadvantaged, but there's still, I think, some notion that the big AI companies are there, not here. So I don't know. I think we're on a lot more equal footing with Silicon Valley, but so is London and so is Shanghai. And,
We also need more affordable housing. I think actually probably the number one thing that would have to happen for New York to get close is people would have to be able to live in the city.
So she's got affordable housing as top of the list. What do you think this market needs?
I'm not sure it needs anything. I mean, it's going great in New York, right? I think it just needs to keep going. We don't need any cold water poured on New York. That would be the best thing.
So Fred, you've been a huge supporter of this ecosystem and this city in a lot of ways outside of your work, starting Tech NYC, the computer science program in the public schools. Talk a little bit about that work and why you've done it and what you get from it.
Both of those are examples of just seeing a problem and thinking, I know how to fix this. That's what gets me excited. Is a problem that I witness and I actually think the answer is right in front of me. So in the case of Tech NYC, for the entire Bloomberg administration, whenever there was a tech issue that would pop up, 5 of us would get called down to City Hall. It was the same 5 people, right? And I said to the mayor and a bunch of other people, there's there's thousands of people in the tech, community here that could be helping you figure this out. And you always call the same 5 people. And they're like, well, but you're the 5 people we know. I said, okay, we got to solve that problem, right? And so the idea was Tech NYC, create a group of people that can have the interface to the city and state government. And then when an issue comes up, they would know the 5 right people as opposed to the 5 same people. Right. And I didn't want to keep going to those meetings. It was I was spending 10 or 20% of my time going to these meetings. I don't want to do that. So that was a problem that it needed to get solved. And it got solved in a great way. Computer science, the same thing. I saw how desperately the companies in New York needed computer science talent and how, a million kids were going to a school system where they weren't teaching computer science. And it just seemed nuts to me. We have a voracious appetite for talent and they're not teaching it in the school system. So got to solve that problem, right?
Where is that program now?
10 years in. We're now doing the second rev of it. And we've got it up to every year, about 200,000 kids take a computer science class in the New York City public school system. So that's 20% of the kids. That's every year, right? So on any 3-year, say in an elementary school band or a middle school band or a high school band, 60 to 70% of kids get a computer science experience in one of those bands. So we've got it to scale now. You just got to stay on it. You got to keep pressuring them to keep doing it. That's the issue.
So Fred, you've been an investor in New York in the bubble, in the crash, in the early days coming back, in another bubble, in a reset, and whatever this AI thing is, you could go back in time, what's the most fun?
Right now, it's just, you all know this, the number of things that are changing at the same time right now is just incredible, just enormous opportunity. It's not just technology, it's society and things like the changing climate and, the arrival of real consumer AI. It's a really dynamic time, and it's the most fun time that I've ever had to be in this business. I can't quit.